discard would catch fire, and they would go up like that, okay? Franklin's stove ended all that. All right? He was the first person to chart the Gulf Stream, conducted the first meteorological experiments in America, the first studies in population growth, and to his surprise, he was finding out that the American population was fast outpacing the European population. He described the symptoms of lead poisoning and an early account of germ theory. And he was the most important pioneer in the science of electricity, of which we'll be talking about a little bit more. In 1761, he invented the harmonica, a musical instrument that functioned by spinning glass globes while touching them with moist fingers. Both Mozart and Beethoven wrote music for this instrument. And for all of these inventions, he never took a single dime in compensation. He wrote, "As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours. And this we should do freely and generously." Now, I might add, by the time he wrote this, he was already pretty wealthy, so, you know. But still, he never took any money for these inventions. He was a great statesman and diplomat. He was a member of and president of the Pennsylvania Assembly, Postmaster General for both the British colonies and the first United States Postmaster, representative to the British government for the colonies of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Delaware, a member of the Continental Congress, and he was on the committee for drafting the Declaration of Independence, ambassador for the United States to the Court of France, signer of the Treaty of Peace between America and Great Britain, delegate from Pennsylvania and signer of the United States Constitution, and he is the only founding father who is a signatory to all four of the major documents of the founding of the United States: the Declaration, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the United States Constitution. He's the only one who signed all of them. And this is not a complete list of his accomplishments. This is just scratching the surface. So let me tell you a little bit about the life of Benjamin Franklin. He was born on January 17, 1706 in Boston, Massachusetts. His father, Josiah, was a candle maker, one of the lower echelon professions. In those days, you made candles by mixing ashes with boiled animal fat. So it wasn't what you would call like a glamour profession for the most part, okay? Ben is the 15th and 17th of 17 children, and the 10th and last boy, okay? So he is pretty far down on the pecking order, okay? But this does cause him to have to develop a habit of self-reliance, because his parents are too busy and his siblings are taking care of his siblings and everything else, so he has to be self-reliant. He's too far down the pecking order not to be. He was obviously intelligent. His father sent him to grammar school in the hopes that he would be able to attend Harvard College someday, but he was unable to pay for more than 2 years' worth of schooling. However, Franklin's precocious intelligence caused him to devour books. He later claimed that he could never remember a time when he couldn't read. Now, at age 13, he needs to be apprenticed. His father needs to find him a trade. And his father tried him out in a variety of trades, including candle making, his own. None of this was found particularly interesting. Eventually, though, he apprenticed him to Ben's older brother, James, who had just returned to Boston to set up a printing business of his own. Now, this is something that appealed to Franklin, okay? He liked to read, he liked letters, this had to do with publishing and things, so this is ideal for Ben. However, Ben and his brother James did not get along well. It is very difficult to be around someone who thinks they are smarter than you. It's even harder to be around that person when they seem to be able to demonstrate it any time they choose. Worst of all is when this person is your little brother, okay? When Ben was 16, James set out to publish Boston's first newspaper, the New England Courant. And Ben desperately wanted to write for it. But James was not about to have his little brother working on his new venture. So in order to get around this, Ben devised an ingenious plan. He created an alternative persona, and he began slipping letters to the newspaper for publication under the door at night. And these letters were written under the name of Silence Dogood. Now, Silence Dogood was allegedly a middle-aged country widow who liked to dispense unsolicited advice, sort of a nebbish Dear Abby type person, okay? Although readers understood that this was not her real name, everyone thought the letters were otherwise genuine. So Franklin is a 16-year-old boy writing letters in the voice of a middle-aged countrywoman, and everybody believes they're authentic. Okay? Now, like everything Franklin would write in his life, his letters are a big hit with James readers, being both funny and ironic. This is one excerpt from one of his letters on the nature of higher education. Silas Dogood would write, "I reflected in my mind on the extreme folly of those parents who, blind to their children's dullness and insensitive to the solidity of their skulls, because they think their purses can afford it, will needs send them to the temple of learning, where, for want of a suitable genius, they learn little more than how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room genteelly, which might as well be acquired at a dancing school, and from whence they return, after abundance of trouble and charge, as great a blockheads as ever, only more proud and self-conceited." Take note, folks. Now, Franklin was an early advocate of free speech. When his brother was jailed for 3 weeks in 1722 for publishing material unflattering to the governor, young Franklin took over the newspaper and had Mrs. Dogood proclaim, "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech." Now, as an indication of Franklin's prodigious self-education, he is here quoting the ancient Roman statesman Cato. Okay? 16 years old. Now, after 14 of these letters, somehow James catches on to what's going on. He realizes this is Ben writing them. They never know exactly how. And he is so angry that Ben has pulled this over on him that he goes so far as to beat Franklin, okay? Which, as his apprentice, he is legally within his rights to do. However, this is too much for Ben. And at this point, Ben has had enough, and he decides he's going to run away from home. Now, he has to run far. As a contracted apprentice, this is illegal for him to do. If caught, his brother could, and might, have him fined and imprisoned in the stocks. Okay? With no money to pay for passage, a friend of Ben's goes to a ship captain and concocts a story that Ben has gotten a girl in the family way. Okay? And needs to get out of town fast. Now, the captain, being a sailor and understanding such things, grants him free passage. He travels first to New York City, but he finds no work for a printer there, and the New Yorkers, he said, are concerned with nothing beyond making money. After a brief boat trip and then walking the rest of the way, he arrives in Philadelphia in 1723, with nothing but a few coins in his pockets and 2 loaves of bread, one of which, him being Franklin, he gives to a beggar boy. Okay? Now, in Philadelphia, he soon finds work as a printer, because he is very good at what he does. Being brilliant and hardworking, he is a very good printer. He's not even out of his apprenticeship yet, and he's already better than the professionals of his day. But he finds work with a printer by the name of Samuel Healy. Now, this example gives us a chance to talk a little bit about Franklin's character. What was Franklin like? Well, first of all, most of the first painting done of Franklin was done when he was middle-aged. He was already balding, fat. He looks a little bit like an athlete gone to sea, which is kind of what he was, okay? That doesn't give you a good impression of what he was as a young man. When he was young, he was an exceedingly handsome young man. He was 6 feet tall. He was in very good condition because he worked very hard. He swam for recreation at a time when nobody swam at all, barely knew how to swim. So he was very handsome. He was very, very athletic, very good looking. He was obviously very intelligent and extremely well-read. And he was charming. He was charming in the extreme. He could talk to anybody. He could talk to beggars. He could talk to kings, and nobody daunted him. And if with all of these things, just on these things alone, he could have gone very far in life just on these advantages. But he added to that he was an extremely hard worker. He was always the first person at the shop in the morning and the last person to leave. He once said that his father quoted from the Bible, Proverbs 22:29. "See thou a man diligent in his business, he shall stand before kings." And Franklin said, "My father could not have known that in my lifetime I would stand before 5 kings and even sit down and have dinner with one." Okay? Franklin, he's so good at what he's doing, he attracts the attention of Governor William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania, who promises to aid Franklin in setting up a printing business of his own. He says, this city, this colony needs a first-class printer, and I think you're the guy to do it. So, and he promises him that if he gets it set up, he will even supply him with government printing jobs to get him started. Now, Franklin has no money. His father will not lend him the money. So Keith tells him, well, you go to England and use my credit, and on my credit, you buy the equipment that you need and come back here and we'll get you set up. So Franklin, at 17 years old, sails off to London, okay? First time across the ocean, arrives in London and finds out that Governor Keith has no credit. He's a humbug. He's a man with a habit of befriending young people and then dispatches them with nothing. So here is Franklin, 17, 18 years old. He's stuck in London with no money, the largest city in the world, okay, and no way to get home. So he spends the next, but being Franklin, he goes and finds himself a job as a printer, and he begins working. And for the next 2 years, he works in London as a printer to raise money for passage back to America. Now he says in his autobiography that he wanted to get home, just not only because he wanted to get home, but he was getting into trouble with some of the girls. Okay, and he felt he needed to get back to America. So his autobiography is incredibly forthright about his life. He returns to America, and by the age of 22, he becomes an independent printer. He works himself up, becomes an independent printer, and opens his own shop. Now in 1730, Franklin married Deborah Reed in a common law marriage, okay? That is to say, they set up housekeeping without actually being legally married. Deborah had been previously married to another man who abandoned her. And she had no idea what had ever happened to him, if he was alive or dead or anything like that. So she could not marry Franklin legally. If she did, and then her first husband showed up, she could be tried and arrested for bigamy. The punishment for bigamy was 39 lashings on the bare back and life imprisonment with hard labor. Franklin wasn't worth that, okay? So they set up household and began a common law marriage. Soon after, Franklin's son, William, soon arrived in the house. The problem was he was Franklin's son. He wasn't Deborah's son, okay? He had gotten another woman pregnant. They don't know who the identity of the woman is to this day, but Franklin took responsibility for the son, and he raised him as his own. But it did not make things harmonious in the Franklin household, as you might expect. Deborah used to refer to his son as that vile hellspawn. Okay, so as you can imagine, things probably weren't all that happy at home a lot of the time. Now they would go on to have a daughter of their own and a son who died young to Franklin's everlasting heartbreak, but no other children beyond that. Now Franklin decided in the 20s to publish a newspaper. Now there were already 2 newspapers being published in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia could support 2 newspapers, but it could not support 3 newspapers. So what Franklin did is he began writing for the paper that was more successful. Now anytime Franklin wrote for anything, it became more popular. So the more successful newspaper started, its circulation started to boom. The other newspaper began to lose money. Franklin bought it. Okay? Then he transferred and started writing for his own newspaper, okay? And then the circulation started going up. And that's how he started his Pennsylvania Gazette. Now in 1732, he began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. And let me tell you, an almanac was basically a book that came out once a year, very similar to what we get today. You know, it had astrological symbols, weather for farmers, pithy little advice. It was just sort of a magazine kind of with all kinds of interesting things in it. And he published it under the pseudonym, the false name, of Richard Saunders. And I'd like to read you a portion of the opening passage of the first issue. He wrote an introduction. Courteous reader, I might in this place attempt to gain thy favor by declaring that I write almanacs with no other view than that of the public good. But in this I should not be sincere, and men are nowadays too wise to be deceived by pretenses, however specious. The plain truth of the matter is, I am excessive poor, and my wife, good woman, is, I tell her, excessive proud. She cannot bear, she says, to sit spinning in her shift of tow, while I do nothing but gaze at the stars, and has threatened more than once to burn all my books and rattling traps, as she calls my instruments, if I do not make some profitable use of them for the good of my family. The printer has offered me some considerable share of the profits, and I have thus begun to comply with my dame's desire. Indeed, this motive would have been force enough to have made me publish an almanac many years since, had it not been overpowered by my regard for my good friend and fellow student, Mr. Titan Lees, whose interest I was extremely unwilling to hurt. But this obstacle, I am far from speaking with pleasure, is soon to be removed, since inexorable death who has never known to respect merit, has already prepared the mortal dart. The fatal sister has already extended her destroying shears, and that ingenious man must soon be taken from us. He dies by my calculation made at his request on October 17, 1733. So in the first issue of his almanac, he predicts the death of a man by the name of Titan Leeds in the year to come. Now, who is Titan Leeds? He's the man who publishes the other almanac, okay? So Franklin publishes this in the first almanac, and when Titan Leeds' almanac comes out the next year, he's like, I did not die! That is the most horrible thing that anybody could have ever done. I most certainly did not die. Well, Franklin's almanac comes out a few weeks later, and he says, yes, my good friend Titan Leeds did in fact die. And you can tell, look at the inferior quality of the almanac that was published this year. He says, obviously, and he says, the terrible things he said about me, he says, my friend Titan Leeds would never have said such terrible things. And he carries this joke on for 11 years. Okay? One time he actually publishes a letter from Titan Leeds' ghosts. Okay? And he keeps it up until Titan Leeds actually does die in 1738, in which case Franklin writes in his almanac that I'm so glad that the men who've been impersonating him all these years have finally ceased to publish the almanac. Okay? So he just can't let the joke go. Now here are some quotes from Poor Richard, many of which you've probably heard. He said, 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. He that lieth down with dogs shall rise up with fleas. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut afterwards. 1 good husband is worth 2 good wives, for the scarcer things are, the more they're valued. A countryman between 2 lawyers is like a fish between 2 cats. Okay? Beer is living proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. And, following fast on that one, the end of passion is the beginning of repentance. Okay? So good advice, pithy little sayings. Now, Poor Richard's almanac would eventually sell 10,000 copies a year. That was a lot in that day. Now, through publishing, financing, real estate, he becomes wealthy and successful enough to retire in 1748 at the age of 42. Now, that sounds young to us, but in those days, that was not necessarily young. He had no way of knowing that he had only reached the halfway point of his life. Okay, now, here he is. He's wealthy, he's retired. What do? He takes up the gentleman's occupation of science. Now, in those days, there was no such thing as a professional scientist. Science is what men of gentlemen, men who didn't have to work for a living, did as a hobby. So he takes it up. He goes to a demonstration of electricity, and he's fascinated. And electricity at this time is in its infancy. It's really not much more complicated than rubbing your shoes on the carpet and shocking your little sister. Okay, that's about how far people know about electricity. But he buys all this electrical equipment, and he begins to work. And he makes great inroads. And then he discovers these contrivances. He discovers negative and positive charges. He invents conductors, insulations against electric shock. He builds rudimentary batteries. The problem with, what do you do with all this? Okay? He's building all these things, but there's no practical use. And one of the things about Franklin, he was never a theoretical scientist. He always wanted something to have a practical use. You've got this electricity thing, but there doesn't seem to be anything to do with it, okay? You might say that he was inventing the wall socket, and there was nothing to plug into it, okay? So it had no practical purpose. However, he looked up into the sky, and he began noticing that lightning had many of the same properties as the electricity that he was working with in his lab. Now, in this day and age, lightning is for us, it's a metaphor for the improbable. Okay, you know how you say, don't you know that you have 3 times better chance of getting struck by lightning than you do of winning the lottery? Okay, so we use it as a metaphor, it's not going to happen. That is not the way it was back then. Lightning was extremely dangerous in those times. A lightning strike could burn a barn, it could burn a house, it could set an entire town in fire. Okay, it could hit a ship at sea and destroy a ship. And there was no defense against it. It was extreme. One year in Venice, 1,000 people were killed when a lightning strike hit a gunpowder magazine and blew it up. Now, what did people believe about lightning in those days? Well, the widespread belief about lightning is that lightning was an expression of God's anger. Okay, well, if God is angry, what do you do to make him happy again? Well, you ring the church bells, okay? So now here you are. You're standing at the bottom of a tower, underneath a large metal conductor, holding onto a rope, okay, ringing the church bell. What do you think is likely to happen, okay? In In 35-year period in Germany, 386 church ringers were killed by lightning strikes. After a while, you start thinking, I don't think this is making God happy, you know? All right? So this is what people believe. Franklin invents the lightning rod, okay? And all of this goes away. It was said of him that he laid siege to the heavens and he disarmed the gods. And with this practical invention, he becomes world famous all over the world and widely admired. Now, in 1752, he entered Pennsylvania politics, becoming a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And during the French and Indian War, he became an adversary of the Penn family. Now, let me explain this. Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony. Basically, what that meant is the Penn family, who didn't live in Pennsylvania, they lived in London, owned Pennsylvania. They appointed the governor, they took, it was basically their property. And in Franklin's opinion, they were mismanaging it, okay? So he went to London, he traveled to London with the purpose of having the charter for Pennsylvania transferred to the British Crown. Pretty ironic considering what was to come later, okay? And that was his mission. So he 1757, he sailed for London, and with only one brief return, he would stay until 1775. 18 years. And he didn't bring his wife, okay? He loved London, okay? Philadelphia had become too small for him. London was fascinating. He received honorary degrees. There were philosophical societies, chess clubs, theaters, the opera. He loved London. He loved everything about it. And his wife would write this long letter saying, when are you coming home? When are you? And he, soon, dear, soon, dear. He was never coming. Okay? He loved it. And in this time, while all this, he is in London all this time, things are souring between the colonies and the mother country. And Franklin is out of touch. He doesn't realize how bad things are going. In 1765, England passed the stupidest, one of the stupidest laws in the history of government, the Stamp Act. But basically, in short, it required you to pay money to have published legal documents, everything from playing cards, legal documents, wills, everything like that. Basically, anything that had paper with it. Now, who uses a lot of paper? Lawyers, newspapers. These are the people, when you're in politics, you really want to have as your enemy, lawyers and newspaper editors, okay? It was a stupid act. And Franklin worked to get it repealed in London. But again, he had no idea. He just couldn't understand how bad the feeling was in America. And right before the Revolution, he came into possession of a series of letters from a colonial official that Franklin, upon reading them, felt that if these were published, they would prove to the colonists that it wasn't the British government that was trying to tax them and suppress them. It was only a few bad apples. So having come into possession of these letters, Franklin leaks them to the press, and it has the exact opposite effect. The colonies read them and they think this is just confirmation of every bad thing they believe about England, and the English are absolutely apoplectic that their private business was published in the newspapers. So, as a result of this, Franklin is called to a public hearing before the Solicitor General of Great Britain. It's a big public hearing, packed galleries, and the Solicitor General spends 3 hours haranguing Franklin. And the London newspapers said that the language the Solicitor General used on Franklin was so bad they couldn't reprint it in the newspapers. If you know anything about the London newspapers at that time, there isn't very much they wouldn't reprint. So it must have been pretty bad. And Franklin didn't say a word. He just stood there and he took it for 3 hours. And when the hearing was over, as they're walking out, this story says that Franklin walked up to the Solicitor General, tapped him on the shoulder and says, "I'll make your master a little king for this." He settled up his affairs and he traveled back to America. When he arrives in America, he's elected to the Continental Congress. They weren't sure they wanted him, okay? Because he had been gone for so long. They didn't know where he stood. Was he a spy for the English? He'd been gone for 18 years. They just weren't sure what to handle him. But he threw himself into the business of being a revolutionary. Now I gotta tell you, Franklin is about the most unlikely revolutionary you ever heard. He is an old, wealthy man who owes his position to the society that he lives in. Those aren't the people who start revolutions, those are the people you start revolutions against. Okay, so he's a very strange revolutionary. He's got nothing to gain by this, okay? But he's a dedicated patriot. He works for the Declaration of Independence with Adams and Jefferson, and believing that America will need foreign support, in 1776 he sails for Paris at the age of 70. Now, when he arrives in Paris, he's never been there before, as I said, he's world famous. He will stay for 7 years, and he is a national celebrity from the moment he steps off the boat. People line the road from the port city to Paris to see the great Dr. Franklin. One author described it as sort of like when the Beatles came to America, okay? Franklin, at one point, it gets cold, he pulls out a coonskin hat that he brought with him from America, and he puts it on. Next thing you know, everybody in Paris are wearing coonskin hats. His picture is everywhere. It got to the point where the King of France was so tired of seeing Franklin's pictures that he had one placed on the bottom of the chamber pot. Okay? All right? Now, America needs arms, money, and it's a difficult job, because it's not necessarily in France's best interest to come in on the side of the colonies. They have to be convinced that Franklin is a master diplomat, always framing his arguments in the best possible light. For instance, when he was told that the British General Howe had captured Philadelphia, he replied, "Not so. Philadelphia has captured General Howe." Okay? Now, what does this mean? It didn't mean anything, okay? But Franklin had been a newspaper man for years. He knew how to say nothing and make it sound profound, okay? And such was his mystique that the French were like, well, maybe this guy knows something we don't know, okay? So he was a master at turning the arguments and putting everything in the best possible light. Now, in 1777, America's victory at Saratoga convinced the French to join the war, and help arrives from America in the form of John Adams, okay? I love John Adams, and I've often said I love John Adams as only a person who's never actually met John Adams could like him, okay? Working together in Congress, their relationship had been civil, but it was not friendly. When Adams arrived in Paris, it got steadily worse. The problem was essentially a conflict of personalities. Adams was prickly. Franklin was amiable. Adams was argumentative. Franklin was conciliatory. Adams was puritanical. Franklin was otherwise, okay, for the most part. Adams had a profound jealousy of anyone who he felt was getting a larger share of the credit for the American Revolution, which always made George Washington and Ben Franklin his chief foils. Now, about Adams, Franklin once famously said, Adams once said about Franklin in a letter, he said, "When the history of the Revolution is written," he says, "it will say that Franklin smote the ground with his lightning rod, and up sprang George Washington, fully grown, and the two of them went off and conducted the entire American Revolution independently." Okay, and that was the kind of jealousy. Now, Franklin said about Adams, he said, "The man is always honest, often brilliant, but in some ways and in some times completely out of his mind." Okay, so they did not get along terribly well. When Adams arrived in France, it appeared that Franklin wasn't doing anything but going to the theater and to the salons, and Franklin wouldn't get down to work. They did trade agreements, military alliances, and Franklin didn't seem to be doing any work. And what Adams couldn't understand, that the foppish French aristocrats in their high-heeled shoes and powdered wigs and everything, they just didn't do business the way they did things in Puritan Massachusetts, okay? Two cities could not be further apart, Massachusetts and Paris, all right? Franklin understood that the French needed to be courted. They needed to be wooed. They needed to be seduced. And if there was ever a man for the job, it was Franklin, okay? The salons of Paris were controlled by the women. They set the terms of conversation. Franklin understood that if you get the women on your side, you're about halfway to getting the men. The men have the power, but the women have the influence, and power is the plaything of influence. So Franklin went about getting the women on his side, and that got him more than halfway to getting to the men. Now Adams, consequently, the French only wanted to deal with Franklin. Adams went off to deal with the Dutch, for whom he had a better understanding. Now, was Franklin really as amorous as legend has it? Okay, and there are a lot of stories about this. Nobody really knows. The French love these type of stories and often repeating them, but I have said that I don't know too many fat, balding, gouty, 70-year-old men who, upon getting a reputation as Paris's greatest lover, are going to deny it. Okay? No, nothing like that. Okay, that doesn't happen. Okay, so nobody really knows, but he was, certainly women did adore him. Okay? When the war was finally won and the peace made, Franklin wished to go home. He was quite ill by this time, and he wasn't certain that he could survive the journey to the French seaport. Now, the king and queen, who was beginning to hear the rumblings of the French Revolution, and here they've got the world's foremost symbol of freedom in their thing, they were anxious to get rid of him. So they supplied him with a boat and a carriage to get to the boat and everything like that, anything to get him out of the country. In 1785, he was succeeded by Thomas Jefferson, and he sailed home to Philadelphia. He was immediately elected governor of Pennsylvania. George Washington at the time thought he was crazy. George Washington spent his entire public life trying to get out of public life. And here's Franklin, who could rest on his laurels, now becoming, at age nearly 80, becoming president of Pennsylvania. The two of them, for the both of them, they still had one more task. For Washington, his greatest, and for Franklin, pretty much his last. Franklin is elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention that was convened in Philadelphia to create a new structure of government. Now, Franklin made very few substantive contributions to the Constitution. He wasn't a great political theorist. In fact, the only contribution to the Constitution that they know for sure is from Franklin is originally they didn't want to have impeachment. Okay, the framers, they felt that that was unnecessary. Until Franklin pointed out that if they got a bad public official, the only way to get rid of him then would be assassination. So, okay, well, we'll have impeachment. Okay, so he worked mostly as a diplomat, getting people to work together who otherwise could not stand each other. He would invite them to his home, he would have them to dinner, and get them talking to one another. And that's basically what he did at the Constitutional Convention. Now, at the end, he gave a speech defending the Constitution, because nobody was happy with it, okay? Only 33 of the 55 people even signed it, okay? And those 33 very reluctantly. He said, I confess that I do not entirely approve this Constitution at present, but sir, I am not sure I shall ever approve it. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. I cannot help expressing in English that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility and make manifest our unanimity, put his name on the instrument. Okay? Good advice. The Franklin's last public act was to lead the signatures on a petition sent to the first Congress for the abolition of slavery. Franklin had actually briefly owned slaves in his youth. But upon visiting a school for black children and seeing that they were learning at a rate equal to that of white children, his eyes were opened and he became one of America's first anti-slavery activists. In this petition in 1790, he urged the Congress grant liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into a state of perpetual bondage. And this act greatly reduced his renown in the southern states. Now, for the remaining 2 years of his life, he dabbled in a number of pursuits, but in 1789, he died at the age of 84. And in 1728, at age 22, Franklin wrote what he hoped would be his own epitaph. It said, "B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will be, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author." And that is my talk on Franklin. And I would be delighted to take any questions you might have on Franklin. Yes?
You talked about when he was older, he started to dabble in science.
Yes.
And that's when he experimented with electricity.
Yes.
And everybody thought electricity came from the gods, and he sort of disproved that.
Yes.
Did he run into trouble with the church?
No, actually within a year, the Vatican put a lightning rod on top of St. Peter's. That's not to say that Franklin, that's not to say that as a young man, he ran afoul of Cotton Mather in Boston. And he was manifestly atheist. There's no question about that. And he believed in God. He believed in the deistic view of God, that God set the universe like a clock and everything like that. And but he was wonderful at getting along with people, even people who didn't always agree with him. Now there were people like Adams who it was never going to happen. Okay, but that had more to do with Adams than it had to do with Franklin in most respects. So he was good friends with George Whitefield, the very famous preacher, and he published Whitefield's work for him, and Whitefield tried to convert him, but to no effect. Okay, but he was always good friends, and later on, after Whitefield died, and people were accusing Whitefield of chicanery, Franklin said, absolutely not. The man was as honest as the day is long. So he got along with people, all manner of people, and that was part of his charm. He could get along with everybody. I will tell you my personal opinion of Franklin's character, having read much about him, is I think he was a man who didn't love anybody. I don't think he hated anybody. I think he liked everybody. Okay, he just liked people. But if somebody he was close to was outside his realm of vision, out of sight, out of mind. Okay, but I don't think he ever hated anybody. I don't think it was within him, okay? But I think things that other people would do that might irritate other people, moral failings, Franklin found it more amusing than anything else. You know, he just wasn't the type of person who got very, you know, he was well aware of his own shortcomings and everything. He spent a good part of his early life trying to affect moral perfection, and he talks about his autobiography. And by the end of the experiment, he realizes it's absolutely ridiculous. You can't get moral perfection, you know. But he, you know, so I hope that answers your question. No, he didn't get into church, in the problems with the church for that. Now, I should tell you too, he was a great believer in public religion. Any new church that started up in Philadelphia, he always gave a contribution when they were starting, okay? Because he felt religion was good for the community, even if he didn't personally believe in a lot of the tenets of it. He still felt that it helped the community to have, you know, it was morally, you know, productive. He was a Mason, and I think he was more committed to that than he was to any sort of religion. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Didn't he and his son disagree on the politics of the United States?
Yes, you're right. His son, William, when he became an adult, Franklin actually got him the job as Royal Governor of New Jersey. Okay, so he was a royal governor at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Now, his son stayed loyal to the crown, okay, and Franklin cut him off. That's the one person that Franklin never could bring himself to forgive. And I think they met twice briefly for the rest of their lives, but he basically cut his son off and never spoke to him again. Because he just, him staying loyal to the crown when Franklin was putting everything, his entire life and everything he owned and everything he accomplished on the cause of American freedom, that was unforgivable for him. It's sort of a black spot on Franklin's character. It's not something I admire about him, especially since after the war he couldn't let bygones be bygones even then. But yes, that is true. Yes, sir.
In the movie and the play 1776, is he portrayed accurately in that or not?
Well, let me tell you what I always tell everybody about anything you see that's like a movie or a play or anything. That is a work of art. It is not a work of history, okay? So when somebody is writing a play or a movie based on historical events, they are at liberty to change events, to write words that they didn't actually say, to omit things, to get the point across that they're trying to convey. That's perfectly acceptable, okay? As long as you understand it's fiction. Okay, having said, you know, as long as they're not saying, this is the historical fact, the way it happens, then I don't have a problem with them doing that. Because people always ask me about the Lincoln movies and the Churchill movies and all that, and I tell them that's exactly it. Don't expect historical accuracy from a Hollywood production. They're not, you shouldn't even expect it. Having said that, I love that musical, and I think it is a very accurate representation of Franklin's characters, and many of the quotes from it are authentic Franklin, okay? I don't know how many of them, but a lot of them are. But it's a great, and if you love musicals, see 1776. It's a fantastic musical. But it's a very accurate representation of Franklin's character, and Adams too, for that matter. I mean, it's primarily about John Adams. It gives you a good idea of how annoying and obnoxious he could be, you know. So you know, yeah, it's a good musical. Yes, sir.
You're talking about him being a Mason.
Yes.
During the early years, the Masons had a reputation of being quite a cult organization. Was he more of an influence on them, or are they on him?
I think that, well, first of all, the Masons are pretty, again, the Masons are a secretive organization, so I can't honestly tell you with great authority everything that goes on behind their doors. He was not unique among founding fathers as a Mason. George Washington was a Mason, Andrew Jackson was a Mason, heck, Harry Truman was a Mason, okay? I don't know how a cult was in those times or in those periods. I don't think that they would have found that altogether interesting. Now later on, during the 1720s, there was a famous incident in which a man who was threatening to release Masonic secrets disappeared. Okay, and as a result of it, there was a huge uproar against the Masons. In fact, America even created American political party called the Anti-Masonic Party. Okay. And that was really hard to sell that because George Washington had been a Mason and so many of the others. So whether it had an effect on him or he had an effect on that, I don't know. But the Masons primarily, apart from any conspiracy theories regarding them, you know, they basically have been sometimes some words throw me out. Benevolent society, yes. more than anything else, doing public works and things like that. Yeah, they have their funny ceremonies and secrets and everything and nifty handshakes and everything like that, but I don't think that they've really, I don't know how much they're really been involved in. I know they've been accused of backing Jack the Ripper, among other things, but I don't know how much of that is really true. So, again, but like this, they're pretty secretive, so anything that most people don't say about them is pretty much speculation anyway. Any other questions?
This Adams you talked about, was he one of our presidents?
Yes, our second president.
Our second, I was gonna say.
Yes, wonderful man. I mean, he was John Adams, like I said, I love John Adams. He just liked an argument. He loved an argument. And his good friend, and sometimes enemy Thomas Jefferson, I mean, that was one of the problems they had, is Jefferson wanted to avoid an argument at all costs, and Adams loved arguments. It was his preferred form of conversation. Okay, so he could be very difficult to be with. In fact, there's a story that in the 1770s, Franklin and Adams were traveling up to New York to visit General Washington, and they were staying at an inn, and they were sleeping in the same bed, because that's what you did back then. If you rented a room, and if they had a big bed, people shared 2, 3, sometimes 4 in a bed. So they're sharing a bed together, and Franklin wants the window open, because he believes this is good health. Okay, this is going to be good health. Adams wants the window closed because he's afraid of getting a chill. So Franklin begins going into Adams and telling him his long, elaborate theory about this source of disease and everything like that. And Adams said it was wonderful, put me right to sleep. So, he was Adams is great, and I'll tell you, Adams is not considered high as a president, but he did one. I'll tell you what my personal thought is. On Adams's tombstone, his epitaph is, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of avoiding war with France." Okay? Because he lost the presidency because he wouldn't go to war with France at a time when it would have been a very popular move, and he knew it was the wrong thing to do. Okay? He negotiated instead, and he kept us out of an unnecessary, possibly disastrous war with France. And for that, he lost the presidency. I wish other presidents would have followed his lead, okay, from time to time, okay? So he was one thing about John Adams had this unfailing moral compass, okay? He never failed to follow it, okay? But if what he was doing, if what he was doing was popular, he was suspicious that it probably wasn't right, okay? And so so that made him unpopular. He was a great statesman. He was a lousy politician. And then he gave birth to his son and successor, John Quincy Adams, who was a great statesman and a lousy politician. Adamses make terrible politicians, okay? Because they're too concerned with the public good to be good politicians. So, yes.
Did Franklin stay with this common law wife all through his life?
She died when he was in London.
Again?
Yeah, for the 18 years that he was away, like I said, he came back one time to take care of some business affairs. He stayed for a couple of months, and then he went back. She was afraid of sea travel, and she was a simple woman, and the idea of going to London, Philadelphia was the right size for her. The idea of going to London back then, I mean, that was the biggest city, the most cosmopolitan city on earth. So the idea of going to London just terrified her. He stayed married to her for the rest of her life, but she died while he was in London, and he never saw her again after he went back the second time. But again, like I said, it was really a marriage of convenience. He needed a wife, she needed a husband. She was a good, practical wife. Was he madly in love with her? I doubt it. I don't think he was ever madly in love with anybody, okay?
Did he marry again?
No, he never married again. He did, there was a madam, I can't think of her name, she had a really strange name, but there was a woman who was a very famous, wealthy widow in France, who Franklin proposed a number of times while he was in France, and she kept turning him down, and she was about 20 years younger than he was, which would put her in her 50s, but apparently still pretty good looking at her age. And wealthy, and the two of them used to play chess in the bathtub together, they say. Hey, if it's, he would make any sacrifice for his country. So anyway, but he had proposed to her a number of times, and she never accepted it. Never accepted his proposal. Anyway, there's a scene in the miniseries John Adams where Adams walks in and they are in, that's authentic. Which is another thing which drove John Adams, who was, I've always said, women or parents, your daughter is going to want to date Benjamin Franklin because he's fun and he's funny and he's interesting and he's the one your daughter's going to want to date. Make her marry John Adams, okay? Who may not be as fascinating, but he was absolutely 100% loyal to his wife, you know, and adored his wife for the rest of his life, you know. So you know, John Adams is a much better private man than Franklin ever was. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You said he retired at age 42.
Yes.
Did he have income from his wealth enough to live on the rest of his life?
Yes, he did.
Or did his wealth increase?
I would say both, because one of the things he did is he was always, for one thing, he was a very frugal man. Okay, he saved money like crazy. I mean, one time he had been eating off pewter dishes for a long, long time, and his wife finally decided, "You're a great man, you deserve to have a china dish to eat off of." And she went out and bought it without his asking him and everything like that. But he was very frugal, so he saved his money. He also, but he also went into business. He had land speculation. He bought the first paper mill in America to supply paper for his newspapers. He franchised his business out. What he would do is he would set up printers in other colonies, give them the money to set up their business, and they would pay him a portion of their income for a certain number of years, and then they would go off on their own. So it was sort of a franchising of his printing business. And so he had that going. So yeah, he always had a lot of money. He, at the end of his life, and I have it as here, he left a bequest of £1,000 to both the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. And by 1990, it accumulated to more than $2 million, okay, in interest. And it was used by Philadelphia and Boston to set up trade schools and help people with their mortgages and everything like that. So his good works are still going on to this day. Okay, he donated money and it's still going to this day being used by the cities of Philadelphia and Boston to help people. So he was a great public man. There's just no questions on that. Yes, sir.
Where's he buried? Philadelphia?
He's buried in Philadelphia. I mean, you can walk, his grave is right up by the street. It's like right through the gate, both him and his wife. Yeah, he died in Philadelphia. He came back and, you know, I don't think, again, he came back not really expecting ever to come back. But after he came back from Paris, he was too sick to ever travel again. They had to carry him on a litter into the Constitutional Convention because he just couldn't walk. He had terrible gout and everything. But his grave is right by the street. You can walk right by it, and it's right through it's very humble grave. Very humble grave.
When he lived in Boston, did he have a Bostonian accent?
I have no idea. He only lived in Boston until he was 16, and he did go back to visit his brothers and sisters from time to time. And he was in good relations with most of them. Even James later on, his older brother. I don't know what his accent was like, you know. Yes, sir.
He founded the University of Pennsylvania, you said.
Yes.
You know how involved he was with that?
At very best, he probably was a person who got things organized. He was a great organizer on things. I doubt he was ever anything like president of it or anything like that. But usually what he was good is getting other people to donate money to good causes. Okay? He was one of those guys who says, you know, we have this really great thing that we could do for our community. Who can we put in charge of it? Let's get Ben. Okay, because Ben will find the people who can do it, he will get the money raised to do it, he will organize it, everything like that. That was what he was very good at. He was just a master organizer at getting the right people to do things and take care of it. So that, my suspicion is that was the extent. It was originally, I believe, it was called by another name and eventually became the University of Pennsylvania. But I believe it was a smaller college, obviously, of course. But more of an organizer, a fundraiser, facilitator of things is what he was very good at. A great diplomat, too. I mean, most people will tell you, most people who understand these things will say that Ben Franklin is still considered the greatest diplomat America ever had. You know, I mean...
He's a graduate.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Well, you may know more about it than I do.
His statues are all over the school.
I would imagine.
I just wasn't sure how...
I would like to, I will need to, that's probably is what I've told you, as much as I know, I need to look into that. But I mean, his statues are all over Philadelphia. I mean, he really is Philadelphia's most famous son. Any other questions?
I
Yes.
heard something, he was involved in the Whiskey Rebellion.
Not that I'm aware of. In fact, I believe he was dead by that time. Yeah, he was
The
dead.
Whiskey Rebellion was in the early 1700s.
1790s. Yeah, he was
He was dead by then.
Yeah.
Somebody said he initiated a tax or something. Was he involved in that?
No. Yeah, that would have been during the Washington administration. He only lived a short time into Washington's administration. Yes, sir.
They say if he wasn't involved as much as he was, we would have probably lost the revolution.
Yeah, he's actually next to George Washington. He is probably the most important person of the American Revolution because he convinced France to come into the war, and we could not have won the war without the French. I mean, at Yorktown, there were 3 French soldiers for every American. You know, they were the ones who really they gave us a ton of money. They lent us a ton of money. They sent us soldiers, ships, and at the end of the war, we kind of we had an agreement with them that we would not make a separate peace with Great Britain without them. And we went ahead and did it. And it was left to Franklin to have to explain it to the French that we kind of went ahead and did this. You know we said we wouldn't, but we did. And the French, I have to say, gained nothing by helping us in the American Revolution. All they gained, they bankrupted themselves and started their own revolution, which was not as nice as ours, if you know anything about it. It was actually a very ugly, bloody affair. And has had but I have to tell you, and this is something that, this is my own idea, but I always say, here in Western Pennsylvania, we are the birthplace of the modern world, okay? George Washington goes out into the countryside and shoots a French officer and sets off the French and Indian War, okay? French and Indian War concludes and France loses its empire and it's eager for revenge, and Britain has this brand new empire and they decide they're going to fund it by taxing the colonies, which start the American Revolution. Okay, then the French, eager for revenge for the French and Indian War, they come in on the American side, bankrupt themselves, and start the French Revolution. The French Revolution leads the rise of Napoleon, which means Britain ups the ante on the Industrial Revolution in order to fight Napoleon, and the whole world has changed. It all started here. Okay, I mean, somewhere out in the backwoods in Pennsylvania, the modern world was set into motion. I mean, a very strong case could be made that the 3 most important revolutions of the modern era, the American, the French, and the Industrial, got their start here. I always say, put a pillar at Point State Park. Like, here's where modernity started. Modernity started. The modern world. Yes, sir.
To fight the British, the French sold Louisiana territory. It was to get the money to help fight the French, and that's how we got all that territory.
That was actually during the Napoleonic Wars later, the Louisiana. We bought it during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. But you're right. They did. The French sold us Louisiana because Napoleon needed cash to fight the British. The British fighting Napoleon. The British did very little fighting of their own. They were so wealthy they paid other countries to fight for them. Okay. And that was one of their big contributions. They were constantly financing the Austrians, the Russians, the Prussians, anybody who would do the fighting, because England never had a big army. They never had a big army. During the 19th century, they asked the German Chancellor Bismarck, what would you do if the English army invaded Germany? He says, I'd send a policeman out and have it arrested. Okay, because it was so small, They managed to run their empire on the cheap. So, yes?
You mentioned the glass harmonica.
Harmonica, yes.
Yes. Have you ever heard a concert?
Yes, in fact, I have a whole set of CDs. There's a gentleman down in Williamsburg who plays it.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. It's beautiful music. It's wonderful. It's just
very melodious and very...
Yeah, they say it's just not a practical instrument because it breaks so easy being made of glass. But yeah, I have a whole set of CDs of this man playing on it and other glass instruments. It's truly a remarkable invention. Yes. Okay, Franklin's daughter married a man named Richard Bache. It's a very interesting story. And then they had a son named Benjamin Franklin Bache, who took over the publishing business from his grandfather. Now, Benjamin Franklin Bache was, during the Washington administration, he was a arch Republican. That is to say, he was a follower of Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you know anything about the Washington administration, it was split down the middle between the followers of Alexander Hamilton and the followers of Thomas Jefferson. Washington eventually came down on the side of Hamilton. So Bache became a political enemy of George Washington. In fact, he used to send George Washington 6 copies of his newspaper every day. And one time, Frank Washington lost it and said, I don't even want to read 1 copy of this man's paper, and he sends me 6 every day, okay? Now, during the Adams administration, the Congress passed what was known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay, which made it illegal to write anything unflattering about the President of the United States, okay? In a later era, the Supreme Court would surely have struck it down, but that was before the court was very active, okay? So these were passed. Bache was arrested and put into prison during the Adams administration because of writing against John Adams. And he was pardoned by Thomas Jefferson and died a few years later. Yeah, so, yeah, that's one of our, yeah, they weren't all just happy guys getting along like they were on Mount Rushmore, to be honest with you. There were a lot of contention there. George Washington was not on speaking terms with any other Virginian at the time of his death. In fact, how many here ever heard of how George Washington died?
He bled to death.
He had strep throat.
The
doctors were bleeding him, which only weakened him, but basically died of strep throat. What had happened is he was out in 1799 in the winter. He was out riding on his horse over his land in the snow. He came in from riding out from riding over his land, and his clothes were wet. And somebody told him that James Monroe had just been elected governor of Virginia. Well, they had a horrible falling out. Washington sat down in front of the fireplace without changing his clothes, and he wrangled James Monroe for an hour. Caught the chill, they killed him. Okay, a week later. Now, I've always said that was probably a very timely death, because if James Monroe becoming governor of Virginia hadn't killed Washington, living long enough to see Thomas Jefferson become president would surely have put him in his grave. Okay? Martha Washington, they asked her one time, what was the worst day of your life? She goes, oh, the 2 worst days of my life were when the general died and when Thomas Jefferson came to dinner. Okay, so they weren't on really good terms. Most of the Virginians were followers of Jefferson and Adams, and Washington sided with Hamilton. What it was, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally, those who came out of the American Revolutionary period, if you served in Congress alone, you tended to follow Jefferson because Jefferson was Mr. States' Rights guy. Okay? And you tend to look at your state as being your home country. If you were in the Revolutionary Army, like Washington, Hamilton, Marshall, some of the others, you tended to look at America as your country. Okay? Therefore, you tended to follow Hamilton's national outlook as opposed to Jefferson's state outlook. Okay? That's a little simplistic, but it's kind of, there's some truth to it. Okay? So Washington being the head of the army, he tended, if you asked him what his country was, he would tell you the United States of America. If you asked Thomas Jefferson what his country was, he would tell you Virginia, as part of the federal United States of America, but his home country was Virginia, okay? And that's basically where it ran. That's why most of the Virginians of that time were not on speaking terms with Washington at the end of his life, okay? They all revered him, but they weren't necessarily talking to him.
But they were both Virginians.
They were all Virginians, but Washington had a different viewpoint. He tended more with Hamilton. Again, he looked at the country as a whole, not as Virginia as part of a greater thing. This is something that's going to keep going all the way up until they resolve it in Appomattox for the most part. Yeah, yeah. So there's the old saying that says before the Civil War, America was a are, and then it became an is. You know, the United States are America, and then afterwards the United States is, it became a one nation after the Civil War. Before that it was more of a federalist system. Which is better or worse? There are arguments for both. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You seem impressed by his autobiography. Are there any biographers that you think highly of?
Yeah, Walter Isaacson, who used to be I think he was a managing editor for Newsweek. I hope I'm getting that right. But anyway, he wrote a biography a couple of years ago that I thought was very good. I've read a couple of them, but that's the most readable. It came out like a year after John Adams by David McCullough, and very much, I felt a good compliment to John Adams. So that was what I would recommend as an introductory to. It was a good compliment to the book John Adams, and I really felt that was a very good introduction to Franklin. Now there's some H.W. Brants has written, but I mean more scholarly work and everything like that. But that's a good readable, straight through Franklin's life. Walter Isaacson. He wrote the biography of Einstein, Steve Jobs.
Da Vinci,
Pardon me?
Da Vinci.
Da Vinci, yes, that's his latest one, on Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci. But yeah, it was very good. I liked it a lot. Anything else? As I told you, if